There's a lot of building in these composable solutions you have to do to really get the data to connect. And I would argue as an operator, as somebody who's really trying to focus on those insights and to that zero moment of truth, get that experience optimization right. The time you're spending on just the plumbing is time where you're not focused on the real problem.
You're listening to Retail Remix, your inside access to candid conversations with the people shaping retail's future. Here's your host, Alicia Esposito.
If you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that I tend to geek out anytime content comes up. After all, I kind of live and breathe it. But today, I'm especially excited to share our episode with you because we're sitting down with Robert Gash, Chief Technology Officer for Hearst, and Eric Best, CEO of SoundCommerce. You may have seen some of the work that Hearst is doing, possibly on Retail Touchpoints. They're really putting their content model, elevating it, bringing it to the next level by making their content experiences shoppable and seamless for consumers. It kind of brings this idea of Google's zero moment of truth to the next level. And a big driver of this new vision and strategy is SoundCommerce. And we always love having panels like this because it really shows both sides of the partnership. It shows the strategy as well as the execution. And we're also able to dig into some of the technical areas that really bring these experiences to life. Listen in, because not only do we get some great perspective from Robert around how Hearst is bringing its business model, its content model rather, to a new era and new generation of consumers. But we also get some great perspective from Eric around what's really required from a technical standpoint to really make these experiences flawless for not just the customer, but for brand and advertising partners as well. Listen in, because I think this convergence of content and commerce is only going to continue to evolve. So by listening in, you'll be able to get the insight you may need to hop on the train and embrace this new era. Robert, Eric, thank you both so much for being on the show. I am so excited to have you both on.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah.
So Robert, let's start with you because Hearst is in the midst of a really exciting evolution and is embracing shoppable media. It's something we've been covering quite a bit on Retail Touchpoints, and it's something that I, in particular, am very passionate about for obvious reasons. So let's start with a little bit of background. Can you share a little bit into this evolution, the strategy, the vision, and I guess most importantly, why now is the right time to make this move for Hearst?
I think it's a great question. And, as someone who spent a large chunk of their career in commerce, I kind of had the same one too when I first started talking to Hearst a few years ago. In terms of timing and why now, I think that the kind of anchor point for us was always people have used media to help them shop and help them research and make decisions for generations. That's one of the kind of most interesting skills that's kind of unique in this space. But as things have moved online, it's gotten easier and easier, but at the same time also harder and harder from a consumer perspective to both shop, but also the selection explosion has kind of led to the classical paradox of choice. And what we were seeing in consumer behavior and how they were interacting with the content we produce and what they were digging into, we realized there was a real opportunity to basically help go further down that kind of path of helping you inspire like customers around what they need to buy or how these products might fit into their use cases, but also finding where to buy and when to buy. And the traditional model where you kind of read and you're inspired, and then you're left to go do a lot of research on your own was clearly creating a lot of friction. And honestly, it puts a lot of work back onto the consumer. So in terms of kind of the why now, it was a clear kind of evolution of what we're already doing and an opportunity to just build a deeper relationship with our audience and help them make that decision kind of further down the funnel than media has classically played.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And honestly, it's something that I, as someone like in the content space, kind of geek out over, right? Because I feel like there's always this focus, like you alluded to, on the initial awareness, education, engagement, So being able to create this full funnel experience, so to speak, is really impactful. So how is this new model kind of transforming that relationship that you mentioned with the consumer? I'm sure you can't share any firm numbers or anything, but can you share any qualitative insight or perspective on how this is evolving the relationship with your readers, with your customers?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's early days in this journey. So I think in terms of the signals that we're seeing now, largely going to be behavioral in nature. So what we look at is how people engage with some of the features we've been launching. So for those who maybe haven't seen it or had the background on it, we have launched a marketplace that's operated by Hearst that sits adjacent to some of our titles. And the goal of these marketplaces is really following what the editors and our experts are picking and covering and partnering with brands and retailers to basically shorten that path from inspiration to purchase. And so what that looks like in content for customers is you are now able to bring in a lot of the messaging that everybody in e-commerce knows helps drive conversion into that actual moment of inspiration. And we talk a lot about this as being a real mid-funnel play. So you've got folks that might know they need a new vacuum cleaner because they just got a pet. But there are 230 some odd million results if you search for vacuum cleaner in your favorite search engine. And if you go to any of your favorite retailers, there are thousands of vacuum cleaners that come up. So how do you start? What do you look for? Unless you're really a vacuum cleaner geek, it can be really intimidating. And so what we're doing with the content is basically saying, look, here's the list of things you should consider, and often covering the use cases that they're good for. But bringing more of that information around availability, around price, around shipping into that content experience and making the transition into the deeper research phase seamless. So we've launched experiences where you can bring up what is effectively a mini version of a detail page without ever leaving the content you're reading. And while that may or may not be as useful for vacuum cleaners, there's a lot of product categories where it's really powerful. You think of fashion. You might want to know, is it available in a color that I like and a size that fits me? And anybody who's shopped for fashion online knows there's often many variants that are out of stock, or the price in some cases can vary based on the variant you're choosing. And doing all of that research after you've been inspired, well, that's just a barrier to conversion. So how do we shorten that path from, oh, I like this thing, or I'm really intrigued, but I still have some questions that I might need to get answered that aren't going to be covered by the actual content we produced. That's what we measure. And we've seen some really interesting signs around the engagement drivers when we enable that experience versus kind of just the traditional bare link that might have a price, but just steers you off to do additional research on your own. So that's kind of what we're focused on. And I will say the early signal has been positive, but our goal here is begin building this. We're starting from kind of a new place here, although we've created the content before. So this is going to be an evolution as we continue to scale to more titles, as we grow the assortment that's in each of these experiences. And one of the things we're really looking at is how do we just keep that innovative spirit alive and develop even new ways to kind of go to market with both retailers and brands alike to make that inspiration to purchase path even shorter.
I love that. And I think although it is the early days, as you mentioned, that strategically, your mindset and your approach, I think, is in the right spot, right? Because so many times you want to go from that initial education and inspiration to conversion as quickly as possible. And most of all, you want to know that what you're looking for is available, right? I know I've had my fair share of horror stories, at least from an advertising perspective, where, I see something that I love and I click and I want to buy and, oh, wait, it's not in stock anymore. So being able to bridge that and ensure all the checks and balances are in place is definitely important.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's how do we reduce the amount of research you have to do after you've kind of decided on a path or you have a thesis? And look, many of us can probably think of experiences in our life where we've either reached out to a friend or a partner to help us with some of that research and decision, or you've just got 30 tabs open to the right of the article you're reading, and you're going to have to go through them and kind of winnow down. We see that as opportunity to basically reach those folks and just make the journey shorter. And as everybody knows, that helps with conversion.
In some cases, it's 60 tabs. I wouldn't know from experience, but I've heard from others.
I love that you've counted. That's great to me. I try not to, but I always see colleagues on Zoom and there's like 1,000 tabs up. You're like, oh my goodness, I don't know how you find it.
Got to hold myself accountable.
But that's kind of an opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned your brand and retail partners, obviously a critical side of the conversation, right? Like, how do you design this experience and the advertising offering so it's valuable for them? So is there anything you can share from that standpoint, like how you're thinking about this model from their perspective?
Absolutely. And, I think of this as kind of two sides. From the consumer side, we talk a lot about high consideration. So the places where you want to do research or where you want that inspiration. But on the brand side, it's really a question of how we can help learn more about what customers are and are not shopping for and share that customer more directly. So instead of being kind of a single page, like one hit wonder, how do we drive engagement both for Hearst content, but what can we learn from the behaviors we're observing as people are doing that research? The focus here is always going to be gated. So the goal is not carry everything or have just a completely wide open door. It's always curated by our editorial team and our commerce team kind of jointly. So it's a very filtered view of what you can buy. But as you know, and anybody who's run a large commerce site or worked with an audience the scale of Hearst's, there's a lot that you learn from the things people don't do. So if they looked at a product in depth and they didn't purchase, that's actual signal in and of itself that you don't get in kind of the traditional model. So what we're looking at is how does that inform our strategy on content? What are the questions that remain unanswered for customers? And arming our editors with insights on that, but also looking at how that feeds into kind of the entire funnel of advertising and just better relevancy across the board. And so there was some press that happened just this week around a new product we launched called Aura. And the idea here is more contextual targeting. So lean less on cookies, but still deliver the same relevance. And commerce is a great opportunity to do that because we can learn from the signals in the article, the products that are being talked about. We can learn from what you're looking at as a consumer. And we can use that to make sure we're presenting everyone with more relevant experiences that are going to drive ROAS, they're going to drive conversion, the things that we all care about in terms of driving marketing efficiency.
I love this, Robert. You're speaking my language. So the data and insight is what helps us understand where are consumers searching, what are they searching for more specifically, where is the intent, and how can we arm the content creation side to create information and great editorial that aligns with that, and then how does that ladder down into advertising. But from a technical standpoint, I mean, what else is required to make something like this work? Is there anything in particular that you've uncovered, like from an experience standpoint, to say like, yes, in order for this to be successful, we need XYZ? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, a whole bunch, but I'll try to edit for the sake of time. The first one that we talked about a lot when we were doing research on the platform choices was familiarity. So we don't want our partners having to learn net new tools that are entirely bespoke. I mean, anyone who's been in e-commerce for a while knows like a lot of the early platforms, there wasn't good commercial software available. So you had to build a lot of it yourself. But it meant as a partner, you're having to learn everybody's idiosyncrasies. And so it meant a lot of work when you were thinking about expanding into new channels. So one of our early theses was, look, let's be very neutral in the way we allow integration, and let's pick the tools that are familiar to the biggest audience. So we're using partners like Miracle to provide kind of very familiar integration points and really world-class kind of seller and brand kind of interfaces to what's going on here. And we apply that same thing to even how we think about the site. VTEX is kind of the core commerce engine that's driving most of this. And when we were making that decision, we wanted a company who had a vision for what commerce should really look like, where we could get out of the ground, essentially, in a construction analogy really quickly, but also gave us the flexibility to bring that commerce experience into content. So the thing I alluded to a moment ago about basically building this mini detail page, it actually lives on the mainline article. So you're not jumping into a new commerce site and you kind of have this little modal experience that can pop up where you do most of your detail page type research, where you'll have user generated content and reviews all in that moment. And it takes a lot to make sure your platform can actually do that. Because a lot of us have kind of seen the exit through the gift shop kind of model, where you link out and you're in like a commerce experience and it feels just like a commerce experience, but it's disconnected from the actual kind of content you were consuming moments before. We really had to focus a lot on ensuring our partners could enable those experiences for us. So those are some of the technical things. I mean, to Eric, who's on here as well with us, we look for the same thing on the data and the insights front. So for us, the differentiator is learning from the signals. So basic e-commerce things like in-stock rates and what the quality of the experience is. We want to make sure the prices are fair, that you get things when we promised you would. But we also want to understand kind of where did you come from? How did you find us? What was your path to the content? And what was your path through the commerce experience? And a lot of those things, when you're using commercial commerce tools, there's kind of a baseline kind of table stakes set of features you need to get to quickly. And if you spend more of your time developing that, you're not really focused on the things that make you special. And so that was kind of the underarching like thesis here, or underpinning thesis, was try to find folks who gave us a really good experience really quickly out of the box, where we had the ability to extend and augment, in the case of the data, with the things that are proprietary and unique to us, but we didn't have to spend all of our time rethinking how to build checkout from the ground up. We didn't have to spend our time rethinking, okay, what is kind of a modern front-end framework that gives us the extensibility, but also works without us having to rebuild everything from scratch. So that's been a huge part of our technical strategy as we went about this.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And it's clear that there are a lot of moving pieces involved in order to create this really seamless and integrated experience, which, is always the case, right? But Eric, I would love to get a little bit of insight from you, because obviously SoundCommerce is playing a very important role in all of this, as Robert alluded to. And there are so many different paths through this experience. There are so many different data points and categories of insight that are required in order for this experience to be successful and in order for it to further improve over time. So can you share a little bit of background into the inner workings, like how SoundCommerce is contributing to all of this, how robust analytics kind of support these contextual experiences that we're talking about and honestly are becoming more top of mind in the retail industry?
Yeah, Robert already mentioned a number of really interesting themes that we care about a lot. One being building your data capability and building a strategic practice around strategic concerns that can be informed by the data. On the one hand, you have concerns that Robert mentioned already. Do I have the right assortment? Do I have the right inventory? But then there are more strategic concerns, like what is the lifetime value potential of this shopper? And given that their first purchase is the start of what we hope will be a long-term relationship, what can I learn and discern about this person that I'm serving through the e-commerce business from day one? Sometimes we talk about this analogy of building a continental railroad. You have shoppers on the West Coast and you have all of your suppliers and sellers on the East Coast. And you hope that by the time you sort of build the bridge to the shopper relationship, that those tracks meet in the middle. And given the complexity of commerce, one of the things I noticed is Robert and I have shared history at Amazon. We didn't work together directly there, but we both spent time there. And when we first started SoundCommerce, we overestimated the capabilities of the industry and retail brands and direct-to-consumer commerce companies at large by virtue of our time spent at Amazon. And in some ways, they have set the bar. Amazon has set the bar for the automation that is possible in this industry and the ability to make very data-driven decisions to help build that shopper experience and still turn a profit at the end of the day. So when we think about data capability for a customer like Hearst, we start with the idea that we need to get the basics right. We need accurate insights into orders. We need accurate awareness of who the shoppers are. And then we can build to more strategic concerns as we go along.
Got it. I love that concept of the railroads connecting, because it's true. I mean, you may have all of these systems working together and building something very strong from the back end perspective. But, how does that connect to the consumer insights? And, how do you create that more robust picture of what's really happening and how you can improve? So you mentioned that your experience at Amazon may have given you a different perspective of what may be possible or actually happening within other retail organizations. So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing companies face? I mean, you work with so many different types of businesses at different stages, I'm sure, but when it comes to actually integrating and leveraging this data effectively, is this still just the case of different systems, different silos not connecting? Is there something larger or different at play that we're not talking about as an industry?
Robert, if you want to weigh in there, happy to defer to you on how Hearst is thinking about this. But for our part, There's an interesting phrase. I haven't seen it used as often these days, but for a long time, Google was talking about this idea of the zero moment of truth. And it's the conversion event that Robert referenced earlier. But of course, what's hidden below the surface of the water, if we think about this as the quintessential iceberg, is all of the work that went into enabling that shopper journey on the one hand, and the operational readiness to serve the customer at that zero moment of truth. When they're on the site, they've done their consideration, or they've been inspired, as Robert described, and they're ready to buy. So much work has gone into the readiness to serve that customer at that moment. And again, when we think about the opportunity to put the data to good use, we want to build that capability to execute at the moment that it matters, right product. It's classic retailing, right? Right product, right offer, right channel, right moment for the right customer. When it comes to the industry at large today, there's an interesting dynamic that we see at play in terms of how brands are adopting technology and putting the data to use. And it's, in some ways, it's a classic build versus buy. It's a little more complicated than that, in that there are so many service providers now that can be assembled composably. The term that the industry has adopted is composable, to build capability. And so you could make the distinction between standalone solutions versus those that play nicely with this concept of the modern data stack. And at the center of the modern data stack are these modern cloud data warehouses like Google BigQuery, where you can build business intelligence and analytics tooling. You can activate data to engage your customers. And one area that we should probably talk about today is the capabilities that are emerging now with generative AI when you land the data in these cloud data warehouses.
Yeah, I mean, Eric, the thing I would add on that, though, is just a customer. One of the hardest parts of kind of the current data landscape is just all the moving parts. You know, we use a lot of kind of building analogies as we've talked about kind of getting our marketplaces off the ground. I kind of think of it as a Sears kit house of yore, where you could order all the parts to go build a house, instructions, nails, everything you needed to put it together. And it'd show up on a train car, and then it was like up to you to figure it out. And there's a lot of building in these composable solutions you have to do to really get the data to connect. And I would argue, as an operator, as somebody who's really trying to focus on those insights and to that zero moment of truth, get that experience optimization right. The time you're spending on just the plumbing is time where you're not focused on the real problem. And so one of the things that stood out for us here was, how could we plot the shortest path from launching with really well-known partners, people like Miracle VTEX, but also kind of the after-purchase experience around like tracking and shipping. So folks like AfterShip who kind of help us with that experience. But put that entire thing together as quickly as humanly possible. And for a company that doesn't aspire to ever have kind of giant technology investments, how do we do it in the most cost-effective way possible? And that's one of the things that stood out to us when we were looking at possible solutions, everything from do it ourselves to kind of partners like SoundCommerce, that we really liked about that approach. And that thesis was, we can bring a data model that's already been designed by retail experts that thinks about most of the questions, but that is extensible. And we've pushed Eric and the SoundCommerce team to add some things in that we're missing, but that also gets it directly to where we have done all of our analytics, which, as Eric has alluded to, is BigQuery, but it's a different thing for everybody. It's Snowflake for some, it might be Redshift for others. But choose your kind of landing spot and bring that data in a structured format as quickly as you can, so that your teams can then start getting their hands on it and using it to kind of research and answer questions. And that's really, I think, the promise of some of this, but it is also the challenge. And, you know, everybody's bumped into vendors that claim they have their own excellent reporting tool that's normally like a giant upsell from the core product, but it only answers questions in their universe. And so if you're trying to understand conversion as it relates to kind of delivery reliability, where you're jumping across 4 or 5 systems all the way from like acquisition channel to delivery, that's not possible if you're using 4 different warehouses. Or if it's possible, it's going to take a whole lot of work for your team to put that answer together. And that's one of the things that was really exciting to us when we met SoundCommerce the first time, was this got us much closer to single data set that showed all of the endpoints kind of connected, where our team could really start thinking about, okay, what are the questions I can ask of this data? And how do I think about identifying the big opportunities that can help drive better conversion, rather than having to become experts on 4 or 5 different tools and figuring out, okay, it's Looker over here, and it's, you know, this proprietary reporting tool over here. And do these queries, export all the data, do a lot of Excel foo behind the scenes, stuff that just gets hard to scale and truthfully takes away your brain power from the real questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid point. And so thinking about like the design and implementation process for this, that composability, right? So would you say that made like the entire process easier? Like what did that journey look like, right? Because for a company like Hearst, obviously there are other existing systems, a broader tech stack, I'm sure. So is there anything that you can share like from that process that you think would be helpful for our listeners?
I mean, I think that the thing that I would have changed about the way we approached it is we were doing basically everything at once. So we hired our team, we signed most of our key contracts, and we went live in about 6 months. And we did it with the help of a lot of partners, but it was a tremendous amount of work. And what that meant was we were working with Eric and the SoundCommerce team in parallel. So early days, we had some really scrappy solutions to get just enough of that signal going while we were building with SoundCommerce. But I would say like one big thing to consider is get someone like SoundCommerce in as early as you're picking your tools. And if you can, give them a head start. I mean, things like Google Analytics, those are not changing based on anybody's like choice of commerce platform. And that's where SoundCommerce has tons of expertise. So you can start developing your approach to kind of extracting all of that data and getting ready for it in parallel with the actual build. We did them a little bit kind of sequentially just because of bandwidth constraints. That's one that I would say I would strongly recommend everybody put data even earlier than their roadmaps than we did. We still are really pleased with how quickly we've moved with Eric. But then work core out was kind of the other thought I had on this one, which is the things I need to know about the core experience, focus on those first. There's always kind of offshoots, and I talk a lot about the delivery side of it. In our marketplace model, we don't manage that. That's provided by our partners. We certainly care about it as it impacts the customer experience, but it wasn't something that we could really spend a lot of time on early because negotiating improvements in that and kind of adjusting it just takes a lot of work. And we wanted to make sure the data in the store was right, that the journey was short and easy. And so really also being mindful of your priorities in terms of the questions you want to ask, almost in kind of like a sorted list. And being really frugal with what that kind of first launch looks like so that folks like SoundCommerce can make sure you get that faster. That's something we have done well from the beginning and has helped us kind of continue moving at a pretty quick pace here.
Yeah, I might add just a couple of thoughts there specific to the data journey. One thing that has been true since the beginning of our SoundCommerce journey, we started the company about 5 years ago, is this idea that customer data is not enough. And especially when you're dealing with these complex distributed commerce models that are centered around marketplace selling or dropship selling, operational awareness to drive that customer experience is critical, right? I need to know the customer, but I also need to know that inventory footprint. I need to know how this order is being routed for fulfillment and shipping. I need to know that it arrived to the doorstep on time and that the customer's happy with their experience. What makes this sort of even worse, and therefore the composable concept even more important, is that the footprint is never static. I expect, Robert, you are already evaluating additional technology vendors to help enable new features for the business, and you'll be adding these ongoing, not to mention that your existing vendors upon which you're running the business are evolving their software APIs and the capabilities that those products provide. And so there's this idea of future-proofing the data infrastructure so that as things change, and they inevitably will, you can keep up, you have the responsiveness and the flexibility to continue to provide trust in the data. And maybe more than anything else that we care about at SoundCommerce, because our customers care so much about it, is this idea that no matter how big and hairy and complicated the data becomes, and no matter how quickly it's changing, I have the observability, I have the auditability of the data so that I can trust the data.
So can I ask, Eric, you mentioned generative AI, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking about it, if not using it in some capacity. So how does that, the trust in that data kind of support what work is being done in the area of generative AI? And most of all, the implementation of some of these new experiences that we're seeing really emerge, like Gen AI powered assistants and curation that's really happening. I mean, there are a few different brands that are starting to test that, but is there anything you can share there, like as far as how data is kind of supporting that future of commerce?
Yeah, I'll focus on the analytics and insights. And Robert, you may have other areas that are interesting to you. But counterintuitively, when you're working with a generative AI LLM, structured data needs to be described in verbose, non-structured ways. In simple terms, you have to describe the data using natural language so that a natural language algorithm can understand what it is looking at. And so there are interesting things that we're doing. We've commercialized our intelligent data pipeline. It's called Reactor. And beyond just moving the data from one place to another, landing the data in a data warehouse, there are very important actions that we take on the data as we bring the data in. And in simple terms, we can pass the transformation logic along with the data. So we're sending the business logic as metadata along with the data itself. And we're able to append the data with these very long form verbose descriptions of important concepts like customer lifetime value or order profitability, so that at the time at which business decision makers at Hearst and beyond want to use these LLMs to run the business, they have a higher likelihood that the output of those probabilistic algorithms, ultimately this comes down to statistics, it's going to be more accurate and more useful than it might otherwise be.
I mean, Eric, I like your optimism on the future use of it to run the business. I'm not sure we're there yet. But the side I would take to that too is one of the challenges with analytics is you're using it to drive your decision making. But when you do need to bring an algorithm, be it an LLM or just kind of more classical machine learning approach, often there's a disconnect between the structured data you would want to feed into that algorithm and the way you've transformed it for kind of your operational insights and the decision support. And really the opportunity here is how do you get those things to come from the same exact source of truth so that any algorithm that you're using to forecast or predict or optimize is using the exact same view that you as a leader are using to drive the business day to day. And many of us who've kind of gone down the ML road know that's a long journey and often kind of the unknown when you get started and you get a great algorithm team together and they build a model up for you and you realize it's doing things that are kind of completely opposed to what your kind of actual strategy is. I think that's one of the real promises of partners and kind of models like SoundCommerce is we've been able to drive alignment where all of those algorithms have access to the same exact data that we're ultimately using to kind of build all of our decision support tools. And so there isn't as much of a disconnect, and the value in just being able to land it in these cloud scale kind of data lakes and data warehouses is really powerful downstream when your engineers need it because they want to go and say, all right, now I want to use this as part of my optimization objective in this particular algorithm. They can use the exact same signal. And I think that's really powerful. And it also makes building that semantic layer on top of that much easier because we can know, all right, we're coming from the same source of truth. It's been vetted by a partner. It's kind of adapting as our partner ecosystem changes. Eric, you're beating me to the punch. I have an email I got to send you later. But it gives you the ability to focus on the insights and how do you transform it so it's really easy for the day-to-day use. These base models are not always the things I would put in the hands of someone who's working on assortment or thinking about managing vendor performance. But the semantic layer you build on top to transform it so it is easy to use is really thin. And that's part of the beauty in kind of starting from a very rich and adaptable kind of base model, if you will. You can use it for both people and for algorithms alike and have confidence that they're all going to be kind of optimizing and driving in the same direction.
Yeah, in a word, right? This is how do you define the data for shared understanding as completely and early as possible?
I love it. So fascinating, guys. So obviously you mentioned at the top of our conversation, Robert, that it's still relatively early days for this exciting new vision and strategy for Hearst. But I think we hit on the power of it, especially because across all of your brands, there's this element of thought leadership, expertise, and curation that I think really make your brand stand out. And then you're bringing in all of these commerce and, advertising capabilities that really enrich the experience for the end customer, which obviously is the end goal, I think, for everybody listening to this. But is there anything you can share as far as like the long-term vision, taking all this into perspective, right? Like we're talking about building this really powerful, robust, data strategy to empower the business. So how are you aiming to take that and really bring this strategy for Hearst Commerce to the next level, either from product perspective, editorial perspective, or experience perspective?
so many things that I could probably go into, but I'll try to pick a few. One is thinking about what is the evolution of the consumer interface and experience. The way we're doing it today, I think, is a really strong start. And we've seen really positive engagement signals from when we launch these new experiences and we look at the before and after. That performance is really exciting, but it's not the end. You think about the way you shop for fashion is going to be different than the way you might shop for beauty. It's going to be very different than the way you're shopping for a car. And so the kind of long-term vision for us is to build really domain-specific tools that help you with that research. And it's really focused on what we internally talk about as high consideration purchases, where you would lean on that kind of like expert friend and advice to guide you. Like, okay, you've just had a child and you've got a dog. Like, what's the right car for your family, right? And that can be a tough question to kind of tackle. So we see this as step one in what is ultimately a very long-term journey to making really shopping for anything that you need help with much easier. But the data and the insights piece, and the reason Eric and I are here today, is really the fuel that helps our teams do that more effectively. So in terms of kind of feedback loops, we want to empower our editorial teams with the behavioral analytics on what we're seeing the audience do. And as we build deeper experiences, we get more signal. There's obviously kind of offshoots of that in our advertising that we kind of talked about before. But I think those are really kind of the big promises for us, is bringing more insights around what people are really looking for and how they're doing their research and what they're looking at into our entire creative process. We always want to keep our editors independent. That's the secret sauce. The skill that is inside the tower in New York is just absolutely astounding. I learn something every time I go visit. But I think that the beauty of e-commerce is that we can also generate a lot more signal that we ourselves can learn from by building these experiences out and kind of making them part of that overall journey. So that's really kind of the strategy and the vision for where it goes. And truthfully, I don't see a terminus to this in a lot of cases. It starts with one thing, you get it in front of the audience, you learn from how they're using it. We hear from folks around the questions it doesn't answer. And then that immediately spins up another idea on, all right, how do we solve that problem for fashion? Or how do we solve that problem for fitness? How do we make it easier to kind of shop a look at different price points? There's thousands of different kind of ways that we're looking at over the long horizon to really make our content even more useful to the folks who are running into it and you reading it, as well as make that journey from inspiration to purchase even simpler.
Yeah, it strikes me that Hearst is in a pretty unique position by virtue of the media business and heritage there, under this sort of classic umbrella of content, commerce, and community. As these product life cycles accelerate, you just mentioned this, Robert, and in some ways, whether it's fast fashion or it's the proliferation of creative content, the speed at which we're able to produce, it seems like Hearst is in a particularly enviable position to curate what is important and what matters to your customers. And the data can inform that. It doesn't replace sort of the opinionated approach, the thought leadership, if you will, that comes from having your finger on the pulse of people and trends and so on, and then being able to action on those quickly.
Yeah, I heard one of our internal teams talk about our editors have the wonderful job of kind of being ahead of it in some cases. They're there talking to the people in the industry. They're hearing about what's coming, and they're spending more time with a lot of these products and in these spaces than any of us ever could as a consumer or as an influencer or anything else. And so that really deep ingrained kind of expertise is really what comes to light in the content we create. And my job and our team's goal is really make sure that our commerce experiences kind of echo that. So it also feels special. We have an opinion. We've talked about concierge commerce as a tagline in the past, but where it really does feel like a clearer and simpler and less noisy kind of environment to do that research in. And we think that's a really powerful tool kind of long term, and really where a lot of our product and tech is focused is on creating the environment where experiences like that can thrive.
I love this. I think there's such power in really elevating your people. And in this case, in the case of Hearst, it's the editorial team. And selfishly, I love to hear that. So I really appreciate, again,
I'm trying
the
not
vision.
to pander to the audience here, but it is the part of every time I see them getting to go and do a car comparison, or there's a floor full of washing machines, believe it or not, where we're testing all these products in the Good Housekeeping Institute. And, the geek in me just wants to go and spend weeks kind of learning what they know. But that's where the content helps, is we don't have to spend weeks.
Exactly. And that's where the specialization of editorial comes in. And that's why it's so important to have that level of high touch assessment, understanding, knowledge. I wouldn't say integrity because it's probably a bit too lofty, but I mean, it is. If you put the work in and you have that knowledge, there is integrity in the final product, which I think ultimately makes the advertising more powerful, whatever commerce capabilities you have in place.
Yeah, it's an authentic point of view that's well-informed is maybe another way to think about it. And I think that's the hard part that media has kind of built a ton of muscle in, and we're trying to help them think about new ways to use that skill.
Yep, amazing. Well, folks, is there anything else, like as far as how Hearst and SoundCommerce are working in tandem to bring this vision to life? Anything you want to share as far as the future of media and commerce coming together? I feel like this is something we could talk hours about, probably. It's very philosophical and I think very timely. But is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you think is important to call out? Robert, I'll start with you.
No, we've covered a lot of it, but I think it has to be anchored in the consumer experience first. That's one of the things our team takes very seriously. So we're looking at data, we're looking at market research, we're talking to our audience, and there's a lot of places across the Hearst portfolio where we do have really engaged communities. We bring a trailer as kind of part of the portfolio here, and that's one of the most thriving kind of automotive collector car kind of experiences online. But we also have Good Housekeeping and a really engaged audience there that helps us test products in the real world to make sure we're getting it right in the lab. And so that's really where I think the long game of this goes, is bringing that audience into this creative process with us. Commerce is one of kind of many endpoints, but I will limit myself there because I could probably talk for an hour about where this can also go beyond that. But it's certainly on our radar, and honestly, one of the things that really gets me excited about the work we do here at Hearst.
Speaking of engagement, I must visit Bring a Trailer 3 times a day, Robert. I love that product. And
I know. I love looking at their engagement metrics, but it's also, I think, a really interesting view into kind of that 3, kind of tiered or leg stool, however you want to think of it. There's the content aspect of what they do that's really cool and just fun and entertaining. There's obviously the commerce side because you can buy a lot of the things that are on there. But then there's also this thriving community component. And that is something that we are working on. What does that look like as we evolve our relationship with the consumer? It's a huge part of what our memberships team is thinking about. So there's a lot of really fun adjacent areas that if we can do this well and we can help you even more in your day-to-day, gives us just even more opportunity to kind of learn and be a part of your life.
And Alicia, for our part, I would just reiterate a few things that we already touched on today, which is you have to assume that your business is evolving, as fast as the market requires. That means change is constant. That means speed really matters. But if you're going to make critical decisions on the data that you're collecting from across your entire business footprint, you really need to have that trust that comes from transparency and observability of where the data came from and how those calculations are made so that you can trust in the decisions that you're making as you run the business.
Awesome. So many great points. And it's a very interesting phase, I think, in this emergence of content-driven commerce or the convergence of content and commerce, however you want to explain it. But I think, Robert, your point around, how the community comes into this idea of participatory commerce, right? And there are so many different ways that you can define it and different, jargon that we can bring into the forefront. But it really just shows how all of these different areas can come into play to support commerce and support a more seamless experience for the customer. But I think we're just about out of time. Robert, Eric, thank you both so much for taking the time out, sharing your expertise, and of course, giving us an inside look into this partnership and all of the great work that Hearst is doing and driving this new initiative, this new vision to life. Appreciate it.
Alicia, thanks for having us. It's been a blast.
Thank you, Alicia.
And thanks to all of you for listening. If you have any follow-up questions about this partnership, the work that Hearst is doing, we're going to put this on social media. We're mainly on LinkedIn, as you may know. We are also on X, formerly known as Twitter. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts on this emerging trend and, any of the work that your team is doing. We are at Retail Touchpoints on LinkedIn, at our touchpoints on X. And of course, while you're at it, be sure to leave a rating or a review on your preferred podcast player. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or frankly, anywhere else. We're probably there too. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. And of course, any other folks you think we should put in the hot seat to talk about the future of retail. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to the show. We have new episodes coming to you weekly. And that way, when you subscribe, you get the latest and greatest delivered right to your device. But for now, that's it for us, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Retail Remix. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on your favorite podcast player. Until next time, keep mixing it up.